Before we venture into the dark, dingy forests, this video is sponsored by Harry's, because when you are fighting for your survival in the wilderness, there's no excuse to not look your very best with the smoothest, cleanest quality shave at a wonderfully affordable price. While your survival buddies are fighting over who has the sharpest knife, like how Wall Street bankers compete over business cards, you'll be getting right to business by accessing those hard-to-reach areas with a firm grip of Harry's sharpest ever blades that can be refilled at the same low price of only $2 each. What's that, you say? Your survival buddies are jealous because they're butchering their faces with blunt knives and using mud as shaving cream, while you're using Harry's foamy, sexy shaving gel made from natural ingredients that, for people like me, help combat aggressively sensitive skin? Well, maybe they could learn a thing or two from you by redeeming a trial set for only $3 by following my link below. It also includes a free travel size body wash, and better yet, by doing so, you'll be supporting Harry's cause of giving 1% of their global sales to non-profit organizations that provide mental health care to men in need. That's a very good reason. I highly support that. On an earnest note, Harry's have been really supportive of my videos for a while now, and both my dad and I have been using them for separate reasons. He's been clean shaving, and I've been using it to keep my beard under control, so totally give Harry's a go and let me know what you think. And now, onto the video. Anyone who has ever searched the horror category of a video on demand service or film section in their local superstore is more than likely going to bump into one of the many wrong turn films. This series has somehow endured a bewildering yet impressive existence throughout the 21st century, to the point of obtaining a big enough cult legacy to achieve reboot status this very year. They feel like a remnant of 80s-90s direct-to-VHS schlock. They're cheaply made, they have a trashy, video-nasty quality, and they don't conform to any pop culture trend. But for films with so little substance, there's actually a fair bit to say about them as these pop-up sequels that nobody really asked for, yet leave you just curious enough to know how ridiculously over the top they've gotten over the years. They're basically one of our several modern equivalents to slasher sequels spawning from popular first films, like Friday the 13th, Elm Street, Halloween, and probably more so, trashier low-rate franchises you would be surprised even got sequels. However, the interesting thing is, Adam Green's similar but significantly superior Hatchet films, which released around the same time as the Wrong Turn sequels, did the series' core villain concept greater justice, as those films were very clearly intended to be playful tongue-in-cheek homages to 80s slasher flicks. The problem with Wrong Turn is that it always lacked a clear individual creative voice to establish a consistent narrative and tone, since its original creator, Alan McElroy, was only involved in writing the first film and did not return until he was hired to write the 2021 reboot, which, without spoiling it, is an in-name only reboot because it doesn't utilize the core villain concept. What is that core villain concept, you ask? Well, inbred cannibalistic killers. Now look, I know the sequels are pure, innocuous guilty pleasures designed to emphasize brutally absurd death scenes and nothing more, but I just don't care for them. Because despite how zany and stupid they admit to being, it's difficult to get past how relentlessly mean-spirited they can be, that it sucks a lot of the crass fun out of watching them. However, with that said, when it comes to the first two films, its inherent perversion and malevolence appropriately fits each of their polar opposite tones because they confidently understand and better utilize their splatter exploitation roots. I think most people tend to consider the second film to be either the best or only good film in the series because it embraces its concept with greater self-awareness by having an immense amount of fun with its premise and interesting characters. But I'll come back to the sequel later in the video because since the sequels dominate the series' reputation, most people tend to forget that the first film is dramatically different in comparison, as it was the only one made with a decent production budget and received a legitimate theatrical release. 2003's Wrong Turn might have taken its campy premise a bit too seriously, like every other high-concept slasher at the time, but atmospherically at least, it works considerably well for the most part. Taking influence from Jason Voorhees and sequel-era Michael Myers, Wrong Turn gravitated towards the superhuman side of slasher flicks, where a group of mostly dull 19-20-something-year-olds get lost in a West Virginian forest and are soon hunted by 3 ravenous inbred cannibals exposed to genetic mutations that make them unnaturally strong and perceptive and resistant to pain. The basic gist is that they're presented as more monsters than men to add that extra level of terror and vulnerability to what is otherwise a generic backwoods horror that does little to truly distinguish itself from other human creature features. Now, it might seem a bit derogatory to call it a creature feature given its subject matter, but that is essentially what it tried to market itself as. There was a lot of genuine mystery and ambiguity to its promotional material that tried to sell the villains as more than just your typical inbred cannibals. No, these were genetically mutated inbred cannibals. But honestly, outside of its cool flashy title sequence that dumps that exposition, you won't actually notice they're superhuman until Desmond Harrington goes all Bruce Campbell on their ass in the climax. The most surprising aspect about the first film is that it's not as tasteless as you might think when you consider its sequels. The film doesn't really call that much attention to the cannibals. Instead, it keeps them relatively obscured within the frame, silhouetted in darkness, or simply uses brief flashes that maintain just enough mystique that you aren't entirely sure what the hell they really are. Where the sequels get their comparison to the likes of Friday the 13th is that the villains gradually became the stars of the show, and their violent antics are treated as a spectacle over pure horror. In the original, they're more of a presence than scene-chewing caricatures, and when they do commit acts of violence, it is brutal, quick, and punishing. The 3 killers are always treated as an intelligent pack of hunters. Yes, they do have names based on their characteristics like Three Finger, Sawtooth, and One Eye, but that's thankfully never established, nor does it ever single them out as a cartoonish freak show where they do wacky things like in the sequels. The original genuinely respects the premise of less being more, because we see everything solely from the victim's point of view. We never know where the killers are because they're sneaky about how they hunt, we're constantly running from them, hence we don't truly get a good look, and because there are less characters, the deaths feel more consequential. Its only major problem arises from the fact that the characters just aren't that interesting. They're very flat and modest, with Scott being the only talkative, lightly comedic one. I guess having introverted protagonists is a nice change from the loud, boisterous douchebags of other slasher flicks. In fact, the 2 characters that best fit that description wait behind and are the first to go, and it does make them more relatable and grounded, but when you come to realize they're meant to have intelligent, educated backgrounds, their decision making is painfully stupid to say the least. So at one point, Chris, who like I said is basically Ash from Evil Dead 1, wants to steal a truck and tries to distract the killers only to instantly get shot in the leg, causing Scott to literally just do the same thing, leading to his inevitable but deeply unfortunate death. God damn, was he so close. And later, Chris tells the group to jump into the trees to escape a burning watchtower without any planning as to how and where they're supposed to land safely without shattering their limbs or falling to their death. I know I usually defend poor decision making in horror as an instinctual reaction to being under intense pressure, but the film doesn't present it as a reasonable excuse. Anyway, those are the only 2 major scenes that took me out of the film because the rest of it holds up pretty well, especially in terms of cinematography and sound design. I think my favourite scene is when they first encounter the killers by hiding in their creepy cabin, because it definitely gives off intense Texas Chainsaw Massacre vibes and pays it off with supremely nail-biting suspense as they sneak away, followed by a perfectly placed jump scare. So, like I said earlier, the first and second Wrong Turn films are rooted predominantly in the era of 60s-70s splatter exploitation cinema with some 80s leftovers, where in the video nasty department, those who, in their time, were considered deviant characters had the most exposure.
Baby, what if this place belongs to some kind of cult? Actually, I read in Newsweek how economically depressed places are like breeding grounds for all kinds of apocalyptic visionaries.
I'm not going to go into the finer socio-political details, as I covered this topic extensively in my video on Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes, but as a general insight, these kinds of films typically built their conflict around cultural class differences, where the more affluent characters, as we'll call them, had to put aside their taken-for-granted luxuries and comforts and adapt to that raw, primal instinct in order to survive. Wrong Turn is basically a mixture between The Hills Have Eyes and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where it openly embraces that transgressive, violent, perversive, and even sentimental nature, but without the overindulgence of actually showing you most of it. You have the teen group that are reminiscent of the hippies from Texas Chainsaw, then you have the Hills Have Eyes style cultural distinction of medical graduate Chris with his big dick energy Mustang, and in the end they have to fight fire with fire to overcome their adversary. Obviously, it doesn't do anything thematic with it, but it ticks enough boxes within the formula to warrant a comparison. Yet, when it comes to Joe Lynch's direct-to-video sequel 4 years later, it takes the trashy, video nasty indulgence to a whole other level. So you could argue Wrong Turn 2 Dead End borders on comedic territory, as similar to what I was saying about Slither, which is also rooted in exploitation cinema, there's a lot of really dark shock humor molded into its violence. The sequel livens its premise by setting it around the taping of a reality television game show called The Apocalypse, hosted by the series' best character, former US Marine Dale Murphy, played by Henry Rollins. The aim of the game is that a bunch of misfits and narcissists have to perform survival tasks within the forest, giving them an excuse to split up before the cannibals begin their cruel acts of savagery. On a general thematic level, it clearly goes for the whole reality shows are toxic television and whatnot, but its main protagonists, Nina and Jake, are given genuinely heavy backstories that the sleazy director then tries to sensationalize and manipulate because reality TV could not be any further from actual reality. While the cannibals do eventually take center stage, this film spends way more time with its characters, giving them all distinct personalities and backstories. But I think its biggest red herring comes in the form of the show's producer Mara, who is pressured into being on the show after one of the stars doesn't show up. It goes very blatantly out of its way to set her up as the final girl by emphasizing her insecurities until she unlocks her inner strength with the support of Dale Murphy, only to be one of the first to fucking die. I remember this so vividly because it's exactly the same bait and switch pulled in WWE's awful slasher movie See No Evil from the year before. You could say it's meant to make it feel like no character was safe, kinda like Scream, but it doesn't do anything this surprising again until the climax, but I'll come back to that shortly. Anyway, the sequel essentially set the template for all future Wrong Turn movies, particularly regarding the second half when it enters the more grotesque torture-orientated scenes, which take the family dinner from Texas Chainsaw to its own extreme. However, unlike the other sequels, this film had enough of a budget and creativity to pull off some wickedly fun scenes, even if it does come at the expense of the horror. Since the film was still under strict limitations, it lacks the brooding atmosphere of the first film and ends up feeling aesthetically plain, but at the same time, it does add to that low-budget video nasty charm by actually looking like a film from its era. It looks cheap, but not so cheap that it feels inferior overall, especially when the gore effects, which, let's face it, is the reason anyone is even here, are still pretty well done for the most part. The weird thing is though, the film actually takes a lot of influence from Predator of all things, especially when Dale Murphy prepares for war against the cannibals. I didn't realize how much I wanted a movie where Henry Rollins fights inbred cannibals, but stranger things have happened, I suppose.
Hoorah.
Although I appreciate that the film doesn't overuse him or make him some sort of unrealistic killing machine, at the end of the day, it's still a slasher movie about superhuman cannibals who typically get the upper hand, so it's really no surprise when Rowlands doesn't exactly make it very far once his total assault commences. Despite the stylistic differences between them, I do think both the first and second film have a strange way of complementing each other. The first one is for those who want something committed to taking this kind of schlock seriously and pulling it off with conviction, while the sequel could be treated as an alternate reimagining that simply has fun with it, especially since it has many visual nods to the original, including the reappearance of the gas station worker, who is obviously revealed to be the father of the inbreds. Yeah, it's literally the same plot point taken from The Hills of Eyes. In fact, when I was younger, I actually bought both films as a double feature box set, so it kinda speaks for itself. The third film onwards is just fucking awful. I don't think they're fun, I think they're indirectly nastier, and simply put, there are countless better films you could be spending your time with. Hell, I even mentioned Adam Green's Hatchet series in the opening as being better than any of the Wrong Turn movies, but taste is subjective, so why don't you leave your recommendations below for other modern direct-to-video releases. And until next time, stay safe, stay out of the woods, and I'll see you all next time.